things can happen, and frequently do, to people as brainy and footsie as you.
This story probably occurred close to 20 years ago. I'll recount it as best as I possibly can. My brother and I were camping at a little spot called Lulsworth Creek, just outside of our hometown of Charters Towers, which sits a couple of hours west of Townsville in North Queensland. The spot we were at was a well-kept secret at the time. A tiny little patch of paradise where the water from the creek flowed over some rocks and then opened up into a beautiful waterhole. A great spot for camping. Just up the road a ways was Echo Hole, which Australian listeners may know of. So the day went by mostly uneventful. We swam, we cooked, we drank, we ate. You know, the usual. As it was winter at the time, the sun started disappearing around 7, so we lit up the campfire and started to settle in for the night. About an hour later was when the weird things started happening. It started with the fire. Now, we were pretty experienced campers. We knew how to build a fire, obviously, and we knew how to build one to last the night, which is why we were surprised, dumbfounded, and more than a little scared when we walked away to grab some things out of the car and returned to find the fire had completely gone out. It was not a rainy day. The fire was nowhere near the water's edge. It was not humid in any way. The air was hot and dry, and the firewood we were using was dry as a bone. There is no logical reason that this campfire should have extinguished. So, that was weird occurrence number 1. More than a little weird, but easy enough to brush off. Occurrence number 2 came about a little while later. We were sitting around the fire that we had since got going again. Just sitting, enjoying the peace and quiet. Now, this is noteworthy, as it was deafeningly quiet. As I said, this spot was a well-kept secret. No one, and I mean no one, was anywhere within about 20 kilometers of us. And we would have heard them approaching from far away if they were. Suddenly, breaking the silence, we heard in the darkness the unmistakable sound of someone, yes, someone, jumping into the waterhole. This one freaked us the hell out. Not just weird, not just a little spooky. No, this was one of those moments where you feel absolutely gripped and immobilized by stone-cold fear rushing through your entire body. Because what came next would make the initial sound seem like child's play. About 10 meters from us, or less, the dank, wet sound of footsteps running through the scrub, now on our side of the waterhole. I played this through in my mind many times throughout the years. I have attempted to come up with any possible explanation as to what could have happened, but I swear to God, there was no one there, and yet there was someone there. After this occurrence, we immediately began packing up the car. Important note here, as we were packing up, we had all of the car doors open to make it easier to load everything up. That becomes relevant in a moment. As we're walking back to the tent to start packing it up, out of nowhere, the entire thing just shifts sideways, as if a huge gust of wind blew into it. Or, more disturbingly, something or someone ran into it. There was no wind that night. I mean, the air was completely still. Just like the campfire from earlier, there is no logical reason this should have happened. At this point, we thought, to hell with the tent, we'll get a new one. We're out of here. And this was the point at which the final occurrence of the evening took place and sent us barreling out of there as fast as our little Ford Laser would take us. Okay, let me try to explain this the best I can. The car was parked sideways on an angle, right? The doors that were still open were on the side that was slanted down and opened all the way, so gravity was keeping them open. In an instant, with no wind, no breeze, no anything around, those doors slammed shut. That was it. Perhaps I can look back on this night now and question it with a logical mind. But in that moment, there was no question in our minds that we were being antagonized by some otherworldly force. the intentions of which we had no clue and certainly were not sticking around to find out. We jumped in the car and we booked it. To this day, I have never gone back to that waterhole, ever. And I probably never will. Like I said, there's 1,000,001 logical explanations I could come up with looking back on it. But in my heart, I just know that every one of those is wrong. I'm telling this story in hopes that maybe someone might have an answer for me. Or maybe someone else has stayed here before and has experienced the same things we have. I hope someone has answers, because what happened still scares me, and I just hope I'm not alone. My husband has always loved the woods and nature just as much as me. So when I found out that he'd never been camping, I just knew I'd have to take him. Keep in mind, I've only been camping at the beach my whole life, never in the forest. About 2 years ago, my husband and our 3-year-old daughter moved to Arizona. And being only about 2 hours away from Flagstaff, I decided to take him camping. We ended up in Williams, a smaller town 30 minutes away from Flagstaff. We loved it there. The forest was beautiful and it was so quiet away from the city. It was amazing. We didn't find a spot to camp until about 9 o'clock at night. The spot we chose was pretty nice. It was right by Coleman Lake, which isn't a lake at all, just a big patch of grass. It's a little open field, surrounded by trees. There's also a little dirt road that goes through it. And the best part was we were a good ways away from any other campers. We set up our tents in the dark. Our only light was coming from our car. When we were all done, we started a fire. Our daughter was tired, so we put her in the tent right behind us to go to bed. About 2 hours had passed and we decided to turn in for the night. At 3:28 a.m., I woke up. I don't know exactly what woke me, but I had a really weird feeling. I laid there, looking up at the top of the tent for what felt like forever. That's when I heard it. From somewhere in the woods behind me, something was walking towards our tent. I told myself it was probably just a deer or an elk, since we could hear elk practically screaming most of the night, so we knew they were close by. But whatever it was, stopped right behind our tent and didn't move for what felt like hours. I was so scared, I couldn't move. I couldn't wake my husband, who had his gun with him, to tell him something was outside. I don't know how long I lay there waiting for it to move, to walk away or do something. But soon the sun came up, and that was the end of it. I pulled myself together and went outside to check, but nothing was there. And I swear it never left. I told my husband, but he just brushed it off. "You probably fell asleep at some point, and the deer walked off." As much as I believed otherwise, I brushed it off. The next night went just the same as the first. Something walked up to the tent, stood there, then disappeared. It would be 2 months before we went camping again. Knowing that area the best, we decided to stay in the same campsite as before. This time my parents came with us. When night came, me and my husband were left sitting by the fire as everyone went to bed. I began recalling the last time we stayed here, and my husband pointed out that there were a lot of elk in the area, and that's probably all it was. As we talked, we could hear elk screaming in the distance all around us. At 3:29 a.m., I woke up to something walking towards our tent. I was prepared to wake my husband up this time, not wanting to look crazy anymore. But when the thing stopped once again behind our tent, I turned over to wake him up when something else happened that made me freeze. It started walking around the tent. It walked around the right side of the tent, the side I was laying on, stopped, picked something up, and began dragging whatever it was all the way to the front of the tent. It almost sounded like it was dragging a large stick. The second it got to the door of our tent, I somehow was able to wake up my husband and tell him someone was standing in front of our tent. Luckily, he has always been a man of action, so the second I said that, he grabbed his gun and opened the tent. All of this took no more than a few seconds, but nothing was there. He got a flashlight and walked around the area but found nothing. He said, if someone or something was out there in front of our tent like I said, then we would have at least seen it or heard it running away. But I knew what I heard. I wasn't crazy. The rest of the night we stayed up together, but nothing happened. The next morning I asked my parents if they heard anything. My father said no, but my mother said she thought she heard someone walking around outside, but assumed it was us. And with that answer I knew I wasn't hearing things. This was real. On the next night I convinced my husband to stay up with me. We sat in a tent in silence. Around 3 a.m, my husband began to complain that he was tired. As I tried to beg him to stay awake, we heard the loudest scream from an elk I'd ever heard. Soon, it sounded like a whole herd of them came running past our campsite from behind us. Scared from how close they got, we sat up and just stared at each other for what seemed like forever. Something must have scared them. Probably a mountain lion or something, my husband said, still staring at me with wide eyes. Then, from a ways behind our tent, something started walking towards us. I grabbed his arm and told him, "It's here." He grabbed his gun and jumped out of the tent the second it was behind us. But nothing was there. It took several months before I was willing to go back. I don't know how I was convinced, but I decided to give it a third try. Once again, we went to the same spot. Me, my husband, our daughter, and my parents. To spare you the repetitive story, the first night went the same as usual. However, this time my husband heard it all too. Something walking up to the tent and standing there. My husband goes out and scans the whole area, yet still nothing. Our second night is when it got more interesting and a lot more scary. Sitting by the fire when everyone else was asleep, we talked about the previous night. Everything was always fine when we'd come out of the tent. It was only when we were inside that things started to happen. My husband suggested we sleep outside by the fire this time. That way, if we hear anything, we'd just have to open our eyes to see it. I was unsure about not having the safety of the tent protecting me, but I said okay. We decided to take shifts, staying awake. He went first, and once the fire started to die, he'd wake me up to help him put more wood on it. Then we'd switch until the fire burned out again. It went on like this for several hours, but the later it got, the harder it was to stay awake. On one of my shifts, I fell asleep. I was slowly woken up by the sound of something passing by. Then it passed again and again. It passed back and forth several times before realization hit me. I fell asleep. I sat up fast and looked around. It was pitch black, and I couldn't see anything more than a foot or two away from me. A feeling of fear came over me that I can't even explain. It was like a sense of doom. Something was out there. I just couldn't see it. I woke up my husband, and we quickly got the fire going again, and it was my turn to sleep. Eventually, I was woken up to the sound of my husband whispering to me, Hey, wake up, hey." I woke up, thinking he probably needs my help with the fire. But when I looked over, he was still sleeping, and the fire was out. I looked around, that same feeling of doom rushing over me. Not bothering to wake him up, I got the fire started again. As soon as the small area around us was full of light, the feeling went away. I stood up and walked to the edge of the firelight and looked out into the darkness. It was like the fire made a wall that separated us from whatever was out there, and it felt like whatever it was, it wasn't friendly. The next morning, as we packed to go home, we talked about what happened. Of course, no one believed us, but we knew something was out there. Later, my husband said he had heard something that night too. Something that sounded like me trying to wake him up, something calling him over. And when he woke up, I was asleep. And that was the last time we went camping there. And to be honest, I don't know if I'll ever go camping again. At least, not in the woods. This happened a few years back at my campground. Big white shell for anyone interested. I was sitting on the beach with my brother and 2 cousins we often went camping with. It was later in the evening, maybe about 11:30 p.m. during the month of August. As we were sitting there, digging in the sand as we were still kids then, I happened to look up and out into the distance at either the best or worst time because I saw someone or something very tall from a distance. It walked right out of the water and straight into the woods. Being 12 at the time, it freaked the shit out of me, so naturally me and my brother went to investigate, while our cousins stayed behind. There were no footprints and no paths or anything for the figure to go on. It was just pure woods. Now, the next morning, there was RCMP officers coming camp to camp asking if anyone had heard any cries for help that night, due to someone who went canoeing and drowned in the lake. After hearing that, I wondered, even to this day, that maybe the figure I saw was the man who drowned, finding his way to the surface. I'm not sure. Not the most scary of ghost stories, but just a memory that's always stuck with me, and something that spooked the shit out of me, and still does when I think about it. This happened in 2018, December, just before Christmas. Me, 2 of my lads, we were 17 at the time, and a cousin of mine, 15, were camping in the woods of one of said friend's property. We were there for 5 days, pretty much did all by ourselves except for water. For that, we would hike back to the house to grab for the day, since it was pretty impractical to get water ourselves for 5 days. This region is relatively dry and no water filters, etc. We'd lied down pretty early, which felt rather primitive. Literally, when the sun set. Every night we'd hear boars around our tent, and steps. Paranoia fueled it a lot, but we had a bow, 2 axes, and some big knives. One day though, and I think this was either the last night or the one before that, we were just having a chat after dinner, like we would do often, and we heard a scream. It was pretty odd. It didn't sound human, but I have no clue what animal would be doing it either, and I'd say I know a fair amount of our country's fauna. The scream sounded like it had a build-up, not like a scream where you immediately hear the loudest part and then it dies and fades out, but like it started low and got real intense, then stopped. It sounded far enough, say 50 to 70 meters or so, but then it happens again, and again, and again. Now suddenly it's coming from more sides, and way more sides, and it was getting pretty close. It didn't sound super menacing, even though we were mad scared. It got to the point where the sound seemed like it was coming right where the campfire wouldn't shed light. I remembered that we had set up some traps for rabbits down the trail that day, so we grew as many balls as we could and went there. Bait was gone, traps unarmed, and stupid idea anyway. Rabbits don't scream like that. We had some pretty strong flashlights, but we couldn't see a thing. Sorry for being so anticlimactic, but they suddenly stopped, with no clear reason. In conclusion, this was one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had, and every time someone asks me for a scary story, I share this one. I wish I could get some explanation on this. I've never heard any animal do this, much less communally. Also, my country is Portugal, doesn't have any cougars or anything, which is one of the things I could most approach it to. Maybe there's no explanation. I don't know. Just felt like it's worth sharing. I'm freshly 18 and this takes place when I was 17. I was in a gardening class and we took this trip camping to Big Basin Redwood State Park. It was a 3-day trip, starting on Friday and was supposed to end Sunday in the afternoon. I was super excited and the ride there was lovely. It felt so surreal to go camping and I was happy because I truly do love nature. It felt so picturesque. Anyways, everything goes well the first few days, except on the final night. We were telling ghost stories and we went to bed. It was around 12 a.m. and I was half asleep, and I heard what sounded like children laughing and running around my tent. I brushed it off and went back to bed. After a while, my tent buddy shook me awake and said that he overheard people saying they were going to kill everyone at camp, and when he looked out his tent window, he saw them dead. This caused us to run out of our tents barefoot, and me without my glasses. I tripped and hit my head, causing my vision to split into 4. I saw him run across this bridge we were by and hit his shoulder on this sign. When I started walking towards the bridge, I blinked for a second, and suddenly I was in a completely different area. It was close to the bridge, but it was what I showed him earlier for his photography. It wasn't a part of the trail, but close to the road. I still was worried, cause I had heard footsteps, so I was planning to go towards the river, under the bridge where he was taking photos. Yet, I felt it wasn't right, and I'm glad I didn't. I hid under a log nearby and was terrified. I saw flashlights going across the bridge, as if they were looking for me, and even heard my friends calling my name. That's why, from the darkness, I started to hear this unreal growling. I haven't ever heard an animal growl like this, and I still can't get it out of my head. It was so deep, you'd think it had come from an animal the size of a truck. It was from the area I was planning to go towards originally by the river. I eventually stumbled out from the log and went to the road and saw my teacher. He calmed me down, and we went back to camp. Much to my shock, my friends and everyone at camp was still sleeping, and he hadn't even used a flashlight nor went down the bridge. Yet, we had to start a search party for my tent buddy. He was found at 6 or 7 a.m., a couple of miles from us. It still bugs me though, as I saw him run down the bridge, yet my teacher said he ran down opposite from me, down the road towards another area with more bridges and trails. My teacher had been up and was relaxing by the fire when he saw us leave our tent. The thing is, he doesn't remember much of anything really, but he also heard the growling and was hiding from the voices and the growling. The creepiest thing is that I noticed my tent had moved. We did the tent thing where we use those plastic nail things to stick it deep into the ground, and those were still in there deep. In fact, they were covered over, and I even couldn't find one when packing. Our tent was not ripped and had moved 10 feet closer to the woods. I had noticed this too when I ran out because I was shocked we were so close to the woods. The tent had no rips or signs of damage. There was also no drag marks on the ground, and where the picks held the tent, there was no strain or rips either. It's almost as if the tent magically levitated closest. Anyways, that kind of turned me off from camping again, but I still love and adore nature. Years ago, my parents bought a piece of land in the southwestern Colorado prairie, near the Huafano River, deep in the middle of nowhere. I've lost count of all the camping trips we had in my dad's expansive canvas tent atop what we would later dub as Cyclone Hill, on account of the furious winds we've experienced camping atop the hill. Some gusts, powerful enough to rock our F-150 back and forth. Immediately upon exiting the car, you feel the land. Call them spirits or psychic remnants or just the knowledge of so many eras past, leaving an indelible mark. The feeling of being watched is instant and lasting. Below Cyclone Hill is a spiraling labyrinth of arroyos, dug out from flash floods over time. What's cool is that the deepest arroyos connect and lead a trail down south to where the road curves around the land and heads west, if you know which arroyos to follow. Usually this road is washed out completely, and instead of hard dirt road, there's about a foot or two of quick mud. As a kid growing into a teenager and then adult, I've learned how to track animals that use the arroyo trails at night. Mostly these are just coyotes which yip and sing throughout the night. Eerie at first maybe, but I've always found it kind of cute listening to them make their way throughout the arroyo labyrinth, yipping and howling and singing all the way. There are jackrabbits that are almost too fast to see, lizards that live in the woodpile, and about 1 billion different bugs. There's beautiful families of hawks living in select areas. For years, a great white owl lived in an old, dried offshoot of the river, near cliff walls that rise on either side of the Huafano, the further east you walked. And occasionally you would hear this owl screech, and it was the most hauntingly beautiful thing you might ever hear. The only neighbors we have are tarantulas about the size of a frying pan that like to say hi to you in the morning by climbing up on the walls of the tent. They're very friendly. So now that I've established this area to you, and hopefully demonstrated that I know this land like the back of my hand, let me explain, or try to explain, what happened to my dad and I one random day camping at our land. We always wake up early to watch the sunrise, which is always worth it. It was summer, and the temperature at midday climbed into the hundreds, so you relished the cool, sweet, dewy mornings. While drinking coffee, my dad off sitting at our table lashed to the tent so the wind didn't take it to Kansas, I walked around to the west side of our 12x12 canvas tent, where we keep a sizable wood pile for our camping stove. As I turned the corner to walk along and inspect our wood pile, I noticed something odd. And when I looked down, I saw a footprint. The prairie dirt was displaced with a perfect shoe print. It was a simple shoe pattern and very oval, like bulky skate shoes, except with a more rounded sole. The shoe itself was maybe a size 5. Tiny, especially compared to my size 12 boot. I knelt down to look at it, and that's when I realized there were more, both in front and behind me. Behind the tent, about 35 to 40 yards, is the road you come in on that curves westward after sloping down about a mile south. The footprints came from that direction. At this point, in a sort of half crouch, completely forgetting the coffee in my hand, I followed the tracks all the way to the road. They were almost perfect indents every time, and what made me very puzzled is how long the stride was. Imagine your normal step and how long of a stride that takes up. Now take into account height and possible leg length. Now, this is possible, I guess, but isn't it odd to imagine someone with very tiny feet goose-stepping along in the prairie, making strides you'd see someone making who was well over 6 feet? I certainly thought it was strange, as I tried to match the stride and couldn't, even though I'm over 6 feet. Plus, with this strange stride, I could rule out my mother and sister who A, weren't there, and B, had short legs. Nobody else came here. There are no houses or people, and our land is clearly marked and fenced about as well as you can fence that land. At the road, the tracks stopped. I don't mean I lost them down the road. I mean they stopped. There was the road and then two perfect prints side by side, as if someone had set their shoes down, nothing before that. The idea that someone could drive up to our camp, get out, and walk past our tent is creepy. I find it very hard to believe. If you've never been to the prairie, you might have gotten the idea from my mentioning of the wild and animals that the nights out here are loud as they are in the mountains or foothill campgrounds, with lots of bug and animal noises. You would be wrong. Yes, you can hear the coyotes, but they aren't nearly loud enough to penetrate the quiet of the night. It's so quiet that the slightest of sounds would wake up any moderate to heavy sleeper, and both my dad and I are light sleepers. The tracks I found by the tent and the woodpile literally passed my dad's head on the other side of the canvas tent. Whatever made them could have touched him, they were so close. With the way they were walking too, I find it very hard to believe we wouldn't hear that, considering we've woken up many times to critters coming to check out our tent. Is it possible I misread the tracks? Sure, but bear in mind I've been doing it my whole life and have tracked animals back to their dens before. It's much easier in the prairie compared to the mountains or grassland because the ground is dirt, and displaced dirt looks different than non-displaced dirt. A shoe print is a shoe print, and the distance between them was good enough to make me believe this person was goose-stepping, or just very tall with very long legs and very tiny feet. All that is just odd. So where do the tracks go? By now I've informed my dad and showed him everything I've found up until that point, including freaking him out some by pointing out how close the tracks were to him, separated by just a sheet of canvas. We geared up and followed the tracks out past the tent and down. The tracks descended the hill, never breaking a long stride, which is not only hard as hell to do, but dangerous, as the entire prairie dirt could easily slide on you and send you down the hill face first. I know this from experience. Once down the hill, the tracks descend into the arroyos, and to our shock perfectly follow the arroyo trail. We tracked these footprints with true trepidation, growing more and more perplexed as the tracks crazily walked up and down the arroyo walls at such extreme angles that whatever made them had to be walking almost sideways at some points. When we reached the road and the washout, we found the tracks stopped once again, just as they had appeared at the top of the slope. Only now would we be able to tell if a car passed through here and picked up Mr. or Mrs. footprints. But there weren't any car tracks. The washout was nice and flat, free of any human-made tracks. This freaked me out. It's not possible that you could pass through this area and not leave a mark somewhere. I've made a search in winding loops from the center of the washed-out road, covering at least 100 feet in every direction, picking up the original tracks that led to the dead end and not finding them reappear anywhere. They were just gone. I put my hand in the last two tracks, both feet again side by side like someone had taken their shoes off, and stuck them in the perimeter of the mud to make two perfect prints. They were still soft, pliable, and the mud hadn't hardened yet, still wet from the evening before. We pushed on towards the Huafuno, all the while our eyes fixed on the ground, trying to find even the slightest hint of a track. There was nothing. Whatever it was, its tracks appeared on our road somewhere between 11:30ish when we went to bed and 4:30 in the morning when my dad woke up. They walked past two grown men who were both light sleepers, passing mere inches by one of their faces, then proceeded to goose-step down a hill, down into the arroyos, and run up and down the arroyo walls as it marched on down to the washed-out road it had just been on, only to then disappear again. All in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, on a random summer night. To this day, I think about those prints and really wonder what they could have been. The skeptic in me is just as puzzled as the believer side of me. I really have no idea how or why this small-footed, long-legged person or thing just casually walked past our tent, down into some arroyos, which at night are dark and spooky as hell, and then disappeared back into the night it had come from. I've discussed it with my dad, and he holds the opinion that it may be a good thing we didn't wake up and see whatever the hell that was. Because while we've never felt afraid down there, that day we did. In all the encounters like that, and while we have had other weird things happen to us down there, involving voices on the wind and other weirdness, nothing tops that for me. And at night, when I'm all alone, lying in bed thinking about this, I can't help but wish I had seen it, whatever it was, because the mystery of it will confound and thrill me until my dying day. Sorry if this isn't your average paranormal story, but it was a bit weird and creepy and inexplicable. After all these years, I just felt it was time to share it with someone. Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. As always, a big thank you to all of the Reddit users who kindly allowed me to use their stories. If you want to help support this channel, you will find links to both my Patreon and my Teespring store in the description below, so feel free to have a look. And the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. I truly do appreciate it. And remember,
Papa loves you.